Hey there YouTube lovers, my name is BB8 and today I am going to rank every single Walt Disney Animation Studios movie from worst to best. After doing a 7-month long marathon of the entire Disney canon, I thought I may as well take my knowledge of each movie and rank them from worst to best. The main reason I actually did the marathon was 1, to make this video, and 2, because I was on a quest to find out what the worst Disney movie of all time is. And this was really tricky, because Disney have rolled out tons of masterpieces, but there's also some garbage in their catalogue that we need to get through. This was a tricky video to make, but after going through them all, sorting out the order of the films on Letterboxd, because I may be biased with a few films, and that is how I found the bottom slot on this list. But I didn't restrict myself to only their most iconic movies, like The Lion King, Frozen, or Moana. I went through their entire history, meaning movies like Bolt, Meet the Robinsons, and Chicken Little have made the list. But just before we get into the ranking itself, I just want to clarify a few films before people ask why they are not on the list. The Nightmare Before Christmas, Valiant, The Wild, Frankenweenie, A Goofy Movie, Planes, and the Tinkerbell movies are not eligible for this list. Neither are the direct-to-video sequels from the late 90s to early 2000s. This list includes the 63 theatrical Disney movies and the one that did not release in theaters because of COVID-19, Raya and The Last Dragon. This is going to be a long video, so before we actually get to the masterpieces, we have to get through some slop, which Walt Disney Animation Studios has more of than Pixar, since not that many movies on this list I would consider bad, but they do have more bad movies than Pixar. So, without further ado, let's get into it, shall we? So, the main question I've been waiting to figure out the entire marathon is, what is the worst Disney movie? Truly deciding the bottom slot was not easy, and as much as I love Disney, it had to be someone. So, what is the worst Disney movie? It's Dinosaur. This was a movie I thought was more empty than all over terrible. The story follows dinosaurs migrating to the nesting grounds, and there isn't really much to the plot other than that, which it doesn't even serve a purpose and doesn't provide a sense of where the story wants to go. And a massive problem I had with Dinosaur was its characters, because Aladar and the rest of the characters feel hollow, with little development going around. Major moments, which are supposed to keep me emotionally invested, just didn't, because unlike Tadashi in Big Hero 6 and Chief Benja in Raya and the Last Dragon, we don't get a brief sense on how the asteroid strike earlier on in the movie affects Aladar as a character, which after that they don't bring up the asteroid strike for the rest of the movie, unlike good movies like Hero in Big Hero 6 and Raya and the Last Dragon, where we actually see a key event show impact to their characters. Dinosaur probably has some of the most forgettable dialogue in all of Disney, because even with some Disney films I dislike but are later on this list, I can usually remember at least one quote or an interaction between characters, but honestly, the only thing I remembered was when the bloomin' love monkey opened its mouth. The pacing does not help with this movie either, because the movie feels like it drags on for too long, since it feels like long scenes of dinosaurs walking from one place to another, and I found myself checking the runtime a lot as I was watching this, because I felt bored watching Dinosaur. I'm not literally joking. I can visually appreciate how groundbreaking Dinosaur must have looked for 2000, but honestly, the CGI aged pretty horribly, with the dinosaurs feeling like they don't blend in with the live-action environments, and the character designs looking like some of the most ugly I've seen in Disney, to the point where I could say that Happy Feet is a better-looking movie than Dinosaur. Dinosaur is not my least favorite Disney film because it made me angry, since films like The Black Cauldron, Home on the Range, and Brother Bear made me feel something, negative or positive. But what really puts Dinosaur at 64 is that this is a film where I felt nearly nothing. Outside of the score by James Newton Howard, Dinosaur absolutely had nothing to latch onto. It's dull, it's forgettable, and I can't accurately call Dinosaur a bad movie because I didn't feel anything watching it. Okay, so for those who didn't know, during 1985, Disney was on the verge of bankruptcy because of the release of an animated movie that they rolled out that year, which this film didn't get a VHS release until 1997, apparently, which is embarrassing for this film since it bombed hard at the box office on release, which nearly put Disney out of business, and since then has gathered a cult following and some people actually really like it. But unfortunately, I'm not one of those people. The Black Cauldron is the lowest rated film on the whole list. I can actually say I felt something watching it, even if it was the feeling of Gurgi highly frustrating me. The Black Cauldron did make a lot of questionable decisions in both its plot and its characters. The film does try to tell a dark fantasy adventure, which definitely does sound something right up my alley, but the overall story is an absolute mess as it doesn't make the stakes clear. The world building is shallow and the plot feels like a series of events leading to the ending, which is resolved in the most easy and pathetic way I have seen in an animated movie, because for the titular object, the Black Cauldron, not that much is done with it until the final act of the movie. My biggest issue with the Black Cauldron overall is its characters, since Tehran spends most of the movie talking about becoming a hero, but not once in the entire runtime does he achieve anything worthy of that title. Not to mention that Tehran is Disney's stupidest protagonist, since he had an important job at watching a pig, but daydreams about being a hero, which leads the pig to wander off and be captured by the Horned King, which we will get to him. Gurgi probably has to be the worst character in Disney as a whole, because in the climax, he makes every other character seem useless. And the only time I felt any bit of joy watching the Black Cauldron was the scene where he sacrificed himself. The Horned King looks like a threatening villain, but despite his design, he never does anything I can say is threatening, and ends up being defeated in the most pathetic way that a Disney villain can, with just a kick. Like, not to mention, the level of stupidity of this movie's characters also applies to the Horned King. Like, did he even consider that anyone would jump into the Black Cauldron, like, if he left it unattended? And he doesn't react quickly enough to do anything about it. Like, I think you get the idea by now. Every character in the Black Cauldron is a complete idiot, to the point where I can say the pig is the smartest character, as he refused to give his vision to the Horned King. But if I can give the Black Cauldron one compliment, it had to be the animation. since some of the work done here is impressive, such as the glowing effects, smoke effects, and the Army of the Dead, despite not actually doing much. Even though the backgrounds just came out as plain, the animation is just like the best thing I can say about this movie as a whole. Unfortunately, this is not enough to save the Black Cauldron from bad writing, and I can definitely see how this is the film that nearly bankrupted Disney upon release. But it's better than Dinosaur because I still felt something watching it. This one kind of stings because this is a film I actually liked as a kid, which probably has been the case for many people. And even with its defenders, a lot of its flaws feel more exposed now than during childhood. I really wanted to prove everyone wrong about this movie on rewatch, but it just came out as bad on the rewatch as everyone had been saying it is. And you can probably guess which movie this is. It's Chicken Little. This is a film many people would have expected me to rank this low on the list, but it's spared bang on last for a few reasons. First of all, Chicken Little is such a mess in the story department to the point where the film itself didn't know what story it was telling. Since the first half was about Chicken Little trying to redeem himself after embarrassing himself in front of the town, while the other half is about aliens. They don't even interact with each other at all, and feels like one plotline is abandoned for the next, which does make Chicken Little feel unfocused. The humour has not aged well at all, since there are so many jokes related to the pop culture, and jokes that may seem random, which does feel 2000s rooted. And honestly, if Chicken Little came out in 2026, the humour would have been a lot worse. On top of that, the world building makes no sense, because how are fish supposed to get on with their lives without water? Especially pufferfish people. The pacing is all over the place, with chunks of the runtime feeling like filler before the alien invasion stuff kicks in. And Chicken Little tries so hard to be relatable because of Chicken Little's arc with his father, but is never fully developed, which is what makes the moments that attempt to be emotional stick out like a sore thumb. The cast doesn't add much either, since most of the characters are just a checklist of different stereotypes that should be included in an animated movie. Like, the short guy, the ugly girl, the fat guy, and the mute guy. Which, outside of the main characters, everyone in Okiokes is just a jerk that I couldn't even stand seeing any of them on screen. Kirby was innocent in all of this. What Kirby is to this movie is what Percy and the Hummingbird are to Pocahontas. Other than that, the voice acting is okay, and some licensed music can be a bit enjoyable, but the way they are used does make it feel forced. In terms of visuals, Chicken Little has some of the most awkward looking characters that, compared to everything that Walt Disney Animation Studios came out with after Chicken Little, it just doesn't blend in well with Disney, since the characters to me look more DreamWorks coded than Disney coded. Like they came out of Madagascar, you know, an actually good movie. Chicken Little is not entirely devoid of quality, since it has two scenes I still found pretty funny. Particularly the scene where Runt rolls down the hill and Runt punches the vending machine. But overall, Chicken Little was probably the film that disappointed me the most on rewatch, since it was a childhood favourite, which ended up being a movie that did not hold up at all. Before starting the marathon, there was one particular era in Disney I was not looking forward to watching. The wartime anthology era, which consists of 6 package films that Disney produced during World War II to keep them afloat during the war, for when it ended, they can get to work on the movies they actually wanted to make, which was a valid practice. But yeah, there were 2 films from this era that was so difficult to sit through, to the point I couldn't figure out which one was worse. Make My Music or Fun and Fancy Free. I ended up landing on Fun and Fancy Free, as the worst of the package movies. Fun and Fancy Free is not enjoyable to watch in modern day, because actually experiencing this was a struggle. The Bongo the Bear segment was difficult to get through, thanks to its characters being lifeless and nothing interesting really happening here. And do I have to mention that the concept of slapping your partner aged horribly? Because clearly, people in the 1940s thought this was okay to put in a Disney film. The Mickey and the Beanstalk segment is the strongest segment of the two, but to get to that, I have to get through the tedious intermission with the live-action actor and his puppets. The biggest highlight of Fun and Fancy Free was Willie the Giant, because he was more entertaining than the film itself. It does have some expressive animation, which does hold up well for the 1940s, but character-wise, there isn't much to say, as most of the cast feels forgettable outside of the ones that you come to know and are iconic to the Disney brand. The music was decent, but didn't stick with me after finishing this movie. And overall, Fun and Fancy Free was one I felt like taking a break watching, but only one movie in the entire marathon took me 2 seconds to finish, but it is later on the list. The movie didn't have much entertainment value, which I can still appreciate how the wartime anthology films helped Disney survive during the war. For films like Cinderella, despite not being a big fan of the original, Alice in Wonderland, and Peter Pan. But in terms of overall quality, Fun and Fancy Free is just bad. Before I started the marathon, one thing that really surprised me is how one of the 64 films was left out of Disney Plus entirely. This is yet again another wartime package film, and while Fun and Fancy Free has at least one segment that's enjoyable than everything else, this film felt more like a collection of shorts where I wanted it to be over so bad, and was the second to last movie I ended up watching for this entire marathon. Make Mine Music. I'm gonna say this a lot throughout the ranking, but I did not like the wartime anthology films at all, to the point where I was gonna leave them out of the marathon entirely, but the rule said all 64 needed to be watched with no skips. But unlike Fantasia, where the anthology format actually has a purpose, most of the segments in Make Mine Music just feel forgettable. The film does have a few segments I actually liked, such as the magical pencil, the 2 hats that fell in love, and the whale segment at the end, which had to be the 3 segments that I enjoyed the most, but everything else was just forgettable. I found myself bored during a majority of these segments, particularly in Peter and the Wolf and the baseball segment, which they felt like they dragged on for too long. The music was functional enough, but not enough to stick with me. The animation does show that there is some talent to show at Disney, but the quality varies in each segment. Overall, Make Mine Music is just another package film that fails to justify its runtime, to the point where the ads I watched during the movie, since I watched this movie through a YouTube playlist, were more entertaining than the actual film itself. It's better than Fun and Fancy Free, because it didn't have the tedious live-action segment with the puppets. There are some Disney movies where I can actually see the vision for a film that could have been great, because believe it or not, I actually was convinced this was gonna be good from the first 30 minutes. But after one plot point, it all fell apart, and that film is Brother Bear. Brother Bear does have a strong opening, which introduces Kenai and his brothers with their relationships that are put in really well, and sets the foundation for the story effectively, which for the first 25 minutes, I generally thought that Brother Bear was actually going to be an underrated gem. But unfortunately, once Kenai transforms into the bear, this is where the movie rapidly falls apart. The story takes us in the most predictable direction, with a lot of emotional moments I wasn't able to take seriously, like the one moment where Kenai tells Coda that, as a human, he killed his mother. But I couldn't take that scene seriously because of the awful ballad that played over the song. Like, imagine in Wreck-It Ralph, where Ralph literally told Vanellope that she couldn't race. But take that awful ballad they played, Brother Bear, that's how it undercuts a very serious moment. And by the way, Wreck-It Ralph actually executed it a lot better, so yeah, ignore the Wreck-It Ralph comparison for 1 second. The biggest issue of the movie is that the middle feels like it goes on for too long, with characters such as the Moose Duo and other animal characters feeling as if they don't add much to the overall plot and hold it back from even going anywhere, which does make Brother Bear overall distracting from the plot. And while Kenai does start compelling, it heavily relies on cliches that other Disney films did way better, and Coda can be cute at times. In terms of the music, the score by Mark Mancina is the strongest compliment I can actually give to Brother Bear. But the Phil Collins music does get progressively worse as the movie progresses. Unlike the Tarzan songs, which You'll Be in My Heart and Strangers Like Me are all on par with each other. And the animation looks really good, with the Northern Lights, environments, and the spirits making the movie look beautiful. I can sort of see what Disney wanted to do with Brother Bear, and I can see why people do enjoy this, but I can't really say I'm a fan of Brother Bear, to be fair. The foundation was there for a good movie, but the slow pacing, predictable plot, and underdeveloped characters made this an underwhelming mess. At this point in the ranking, I don't necessarily think that we're in disaster territory anymore, because unlike the films that ranked below this one, but now we have entered the territory of films that still bored me or left me slightly annoyed. And the next movie is a perfect example of that. And yes, it is still bad, but slightly better than the films that ranked below it. Because I expected this to be a part of the bottom 5, which, yeah, having 4 films from the 2000s in the bottom 10 is quite embarrassing. Because this is a film that didn't know how much comedy was too much comedy, and that was Home on the Range. Home on the Range does use a simple save the farm plot, and while there isn't anything wrong with that plot, the execution is what wanted me to turn it off. The biggest issue with Home on the Range is the excessive slapstick, and it feels like every scene is trying to be funny or get a reaction out of me. And because of that, Home on the Range becomes exhausting. I couldn't get invested in the story or the stakes because the slapstick was a huge distraction. Home on the Range does have a few elements of quality, such as the animation looking solid and the character animation is at least expressive, even if that is where most of the film's attempted humor goes. The minecart chase scene towards the end was a scene I actually did enjoy, but the 3 lead cows were not interesting, with no chemistry at all. But Buck the Horse and Slim were enjoyable to watch when they were present. The music is another area I did consider to be a mixed bag, because the Western-inspired score is really good, but Slim's song has to be the worst song in all of Disney, to the point I really wanted to skip Home on the Range entirely and move on to whichever film landed on the wheel next. Home on the Range is not a complete train wreck like I expected, but does become exhausting pretty quickly thanks to the slapstick, bland characters, and generic plot. It does have a few moments I found enjoyable and solid animation, but not enough to spare it from 58th place. This next film makes me wonder why Disney would actually go ahead and waste such a famous legend, but spends so little time on the thing that the movie is actually named after. And I knew going in that this film's reputation was mixed, but I was not prepared for how directionless this film was. And that is The Sword and the Stone. The Sword and the Stone is one of those movies that feels less like an actual plot, but rather than a series of events that are connected with each other. And my biggest issue with that is that the film doesn't ever feel like it's building towards a goal, since Arthur spends most of the runtime following Merlin lesson to lesson with little to no progression for any of the characters, with the sword itself not becoming relevant until the ending. And for a movie called The Sword and the Stone, you would expect the sword to have at least played a major role in the story, but was absent from the opening until the last 5 minutes. The movie does have charming things in it, like Merlin the Wizard is fun to watch, and the duel between Merlin and Madam Mim towards the end of the movie was mainly entertaining thanks to how wacky the shape-shifting fight can get. But there were moments I did enjoy in The Sword and the Stone, but many of the scenes did feel like filler than rather serving anything to the actual plot. Visually, the artwork is nice and fits well with the setting, but the biggest problem here is that the character movement is clunky and looks like something you would see out of a CDI Zelda cutscene. The score does sell the overall medieval setting, even with forgettable songs, but as of the characters, Arthur is pretty bland, and it's mainly Merlin who does most of the talking. The Sword and the Stone was not a movie I loathed, but I do see where the production in this film was rushed. Because of the clunky animation, the lack of focus, and a bland protagonist. It's a better fantasy movie than The Black Cauldron, because at least the characters and Madam Mim are not low IQ like the Horned King is. There are Disney films that are controversial because of poor quality. Some because of tonal whiplash, and some because of how its source material is handled. And this next film sits in quite a strange spot, because I can see what the film they tried to achieve, and this was a Disney film that was designed to be Oscar bait. No, it's not Wish, but this movie is the only in the entire marathon that took me 2 sittings to finish, because I was close to falling asleep halfway through the movie, and while it is visually consistent with the rest of the Disney Renaissance, it has to be the worst film to have come out in one of Disney's most famous eras, and that is Pocahontas. Pocahontas was honestly so boring, I found it difficult to even sit through at all. The film tries so hard to present a serious romance, but it feels more like a simplified and heavily romantic version of the real events that it's adapting, rather than making a story that is compelling. The biggest issue with the plot is the romance between Pocahontas and John Smith, which to me didn't really feel believable, because they met too late in the movie, with little to no development. And unlike a few films later on the list, the chemistry just isn't there for either characters. The pacing drags hard, with the scenes feeling like they are building to something, but don't actually really go anywhere that progresses the plot. And the characters mainly had to be a weak point for me, because Pocahontas doesn't feel like a compelling character at all, while John Smith doing certain things and the film handling his arc does not latch on emotionally. The main villain is underwhelming because he does not feel like a threat to our main characters, and his only motivation is gold. That's it. The animal characters did end up being more enjoyable than every other character in this movie. But where Pocahontas does get something right is within its visuals and its music. The animation is gorgeous, with some strong backgrounds to complement the visuals quite well. Even with awful character designs for the humans, it still looks good visually. The musical sequences are well staged, but the music itself is inconsistent in overall quality. Like, Colors of the Wind stands out, but other than that, every other song in Pocahontas is forgettable very quickly after the end of the movie. The voice acting does function, but is not strong enough to make this movie engaging. In the end, only 2 films from the Disney Renaissance did not make the top half of the list. But Pocahontas at least attempted to be serious, but it never fully came together in a way I can enjoy it. Outside of the animation, Pocahontas came out as the only bad movie in the Disney Renaissance. We have officially left the bad territory, and now we move on to the mediocre movies. Yep, there are only 9 of the 64 I consider to be bad. Well, not Dinosaur though, because that was pretty empty. But back to it. Some Disney films can be interesting, not because of their ambition, but how it feels heavily disconnected from its source material that it's trying to adapt. And I didn't even know this was an adaptation before actually watching this. Because this next film I was expecting to be a unique twist on a famous story by Charles Dickens, but came out as a product that doesn't even resemble what story Charles Dickens was trying to tell. Not in the story, not in the music, and even its characters. It's a film where I could see some aspects of it working, but didn't come together as a good movie, and that is Oliver and Company. Believe it or not, this is an adaptation of Oliver Twist, or that's at least what it's supposed to be. But in execution, it feels more like a movie about cats and dogs going around 1980s New York with little connection to the source material. And the biggest issue for me is the lack of direction, as it mostly moves from one event to the next without much to the story, and the pacing is a big issue because of that. Important characters like Jenny feel like they came in too late to really have anything to do with the plot, which only adds to the feeling that they are rushing out ideas without giving the film enough time to develop them. Where the movie heavily struggles is with its characters, since Oliver, Dodger, and the rest of the characters can be fun, but none of them were deep enough to make the story compelling. Sykes was an underwhelming villain, which, like in Pocahontas, is heavily driven by money and has little charm to him outside of that, and because of the shallow characters, any attempts of emotional or comedic moments did not land for me. That said, Oliver and Company does have compliments, which the animation does hold up well, even as the final Disney film before The Little Mermaid saved Disney. And the character animations, as well as the New York backgrounds, were well drawn. The music also was a highlight, with Why Should I Worry by Billy Joel being a banger, and is probably the best way to actually experience the movie. Like, the best way to actually experience Oliver and Company is the jazz score is good at selling the New York. The jazz score is good at selling New York as a setting, even with an underwhelming plot and characters. But in the end, Oliver and Company was just about spared from being a bad movie. But it is one I find to be underwhelming, thanks to its characters, its lack of focus, but it's not really a Disney movie you're missing out on, to be honest. Just go listen to Why Should I Worry, and do not consume the movie. We are officially back to the wartime anthology movies, and this is where the structure itself becomes a massive barrier when it comes to actually enjoying the movie. Because it feels like an 80-minute long history or geography lesson rather than an actual movie. And that is why it was so hard to sit through. And the Three Caballeros was the answer to that. The Three Caballeros is another hard one to sit through because it barely has a traditional plot. Because instead, it's a series of events which include Donald Duck, Jose, and Panchito exploring Mexico and Brazil, with no progression connecting everything together, with each scene feeling like a reset of what came before it, which the Three Caballeros was hard to follow because of it. There are still some compliments worth bringing up, such as the animation being impressive for the time, especially with a few creative sequences, such as a neon-inspired sequence, glowing effects, and the firework ball, which are all compelling to look at. There is strong chemistry between Donald Jose and Panchito, but with no character development. They're just fun to watch, but not enough to carry the movie. The music does do a decent job at showing the culture variety, even with no memorable songs. But the live action integration does not hold up very well, because sequences such as the Bayer segment make the combination of animation and live action feel artificial, with them being compromised when blending them in to real life footage. I can appreciate the efforts of what they try to do visually, but it came more distracting than immersive. I can still recognize the strengths of the Three Caballeros, such as the animation, the culture variety, and the character chemistry, which is why it ranks higher than Make My Music and Fun and Fancy Free, but as a full film, it doesn't work for me. There are Disney films that are messy in a way that do feel chaotic, but at least something you can remember for years to come, while others feel messy in a way that make you feel disconnected from the movie entirely. And this movie sits in this next category. And while I did already discuss this in my 2020s Disney ranking before, it was a little worse on rewatch, because not only did it feel like I watched the movie for the first time, but also wastes a strong foundation and an interesting concept. And that is Strange World, because people would have expected me to have ranked this in the bottom 10, but the reason Strange World was spared was because it did have interesting ideas within the generational conflict between Searcher and Jaeger Clade with the exploration of Avalonia, but in execution, it feels like it's trying to do too much without giving each plotline enough to work with. The story juggles around saving Pando, dealing with family misfunction, and exploring the strange world itself, which none of them feel connected towards the end, which even with the plot twist, which was interesting, ends up feeling as if it was underdeveloped. The biggest issue for me is that any moment that attempted to be emotional didn't work for me. There are moments that clearly show they wanted to be heartfelt, particularly in the scenes between the family members, but feel more like checkpoints to the actual story than arcs that pay off. The world building was not that bad, and Avalonia was an interesting setting, but doesn't feel as if they did an awful lot, like how Raya and the Last Dragon fully used Commandra to its story's advantage. But Avalonia feels like it exists alongside the plot, rather than doing something for it. Visually, the movie still looks really good in animation quality, lighting, and creature design, with some creative bioorganisms living within the strange world, but the constant pink and green colour palettes throughout the strange world do start to get repetitive after a while, and the character designs do not blend in with the Disney style like other recent Disney films like Moana, Encanto, or Raya and the Last Dragon. The voice acting here was still solid, with Jake Gyllenhaal, Dennis Quaid, and Lucy Liu being standouts, even attached to forgettable characters. I still consider Strange World to be the weakest release from Walt Disney Animation Studios, both in the 2020s and in the past 20 years, but still came out as mediocre on the rewatch. It took us a while to get to our first sequel on this list, but this one doesn't try to reinvent the formula from its predecessor. And even though I wasn't a big fan of the original either, this next film was the experience I was expecting. No, it's not Ralph Breaks the Internet. No, it's not Frozen 2 or even Moana 2, but instead a sequel coming from the Disney Renaissance of all eras. But like Moana 2, this one feels like you just watched the same movie you already have before, and that is The Rescuers Down Under. The Rescuers Down Under uses a similar structure to the first Rescuers film from the 1970s, but it feels like a rehash of The Rescuers rather than a continuation of it. The main issue is that Bernard and Bianca don't even enter the scene until 20 minutes in, which feels strange because this movie has The Rescuers in the title. But once they enter the scene, it follows the same pattern the original did. Rescue the child from danger, which does make it feel predictable. The pacing is uneven, especially since the mission starts too quickly after Bernard and Bianca enter the scene, which didn't leave enough breathing room. Where the film is a step up is its animation, since the Australian outback has lots of variety in locations, and there is some creative uses in how the different creatures are used, such as a sugar glider as transport for our main characters, but the character animation is not as expressive as other Disney Renaissance movies. The flight sequence looks really cool, but not enough to spare everything else about this movie. The characters are another element of this movie that left me feeling mixed, since Bernard feels more confident here than he does in the first movie, and Wilbur, thanks to his performance from John Candy, is the standout. McLeach does work well as a villain, and is entertaining whenever he's present on screen, but the rest of the supporting characters are just forgettable. The Rescuers Down Under feels as if it was a film that released in the era prior and not in the Renaissance era. It does make improvement on The Rescuers in some areas, but does suffer from a predictable story and forgettable characters. And the reason this is the second to worst Renaissance Disney film is because it doesn't fit in with everything else that came out during the Renaissance. This placement is one I know is going to be one of the most controversial in the whole ranking, because I know people have fond nostalgia for this movie, and I get why, since it has one of Disney's most romantic scenes of all time. And there are still elements I do enjoy, but when I actually watched this movie, this was one I found myself struggling to sit through. Thanks to a key issue in Disney's older works, a lack of focus. And Lady and the Tramp definitely meets that criteria. Lady and the Tramp, for me, is probably a movie I find more respectable than actually enjoyable. My biggest issue with this movie is that the story is unfocused for a film that is built around one of Disney's most famous romances. The first act mainly just consists of Lady adjusting to her life after her owners have a baby, which was not a bad setup, but this movie does take a long time to get into the relationship between Lady and Tramp. Even when they meet for the first time, they feel as if they jumped from one disconnected event to the next. And as a result, the story doesn't feel like it's building towards something in the final act. The romance itself is one of the stronger elements of the movie, since Lady and the Tramp do have solid chemistry with each other, especially with Lady's life as a house dog and Tramp's life as a stray, which makes for a natural relationship, which does sell the spaghetti scene, which, to be fair, is the only thing people talk about when they bring up this movie. Like, they bring up the spaghetti scene, but whenever I get into a conversation about Lady and the Tramp, they don't talk about any other scene other than the spaghetti scene. Unfortunately, every other character didn't really leave that much for me. Aunt Sarah, in particular, is more frustrating than feeling like a threat to the other dogs. The film still looks great visually, with expressive animation, especially in the dogs, and voice acting that holds up well for a 1950s movie. And Bella Notte is easily the song that stands out to me, even if I don't remember most of the songs. Lady and the Tramp, while it can be charming with the romance and animation, as well as the iconic spaghetti scene, the lack of focus within the story and the uneven pacing made it difficult for me to rank this any higher than I actually did. People may consider this a classic, But for me, because people only talk about the spaghetti scene and nothing else, this is one of those Disney films I do see as slightly overrated. This next film is going to be quite a surprise for a few people, considering that we are talking about the sequel to one of Disney's biggest movies. This is going to be a controversial placement, mainly because I did rank this film lower than one of Disney's most controversial modern movies, which we will get to eventually. I did not enter the marathon expecting it to be in the bottom quarter, which I do remember enjoying parts of the film when it originally released, but on the rewatch, I realized that I couldn't remember most of this movie, and that is Frozen 2. Frozen 2 does have some good ideas presented here, but they never fully come together to provide a good movie. The opening does set up a mystery involving the spirits, the enchanted forest, and how Anna and Elsa's parents died, which, for a while, does feel like a sequel being built up to be something good, but unfortunately, once the characters reach the enchanted forest, this is where the movie starts to fall apart, because the story becomes messy and unfocused. The plot constantly goes between different characters and goals, which make the film bloated rather than focused. I do appreciate how this film expands on Anna and Elsa's parents, but the journey to get to those answers actually feels like a mess. The film's biggest strength is easily the visuals, since the environments, the lighting, and the elemental effects are impressive within the enchanted forest, with water effects, the musical sequences, despite being paired with forgettable songs. Olaf still remains the most entertaining character from the first movie, particularly in the scene when he recaps the first movie. Anna and Elsa do remain as strong as they were in the first movie, but the new characters are forgettable. Apart from this little fire lizard, and unfortunately, Kristoff's subplot just feels like filler rather than adding to the actual story. The pacing was another big issue for me, since the first act does move through quite well, but the closer to the climax we get, the more rushed each idea gets. It doesn't help that each character arc feels rushed. The voice acting remains strong from the first movie, with returning voice actors, especially Josh Gad as Olaf. But if any performance stuck out like a sore thumb, it had to be Sterling K. Brown as this one guy whose name I can't be bothered googling. As for the music, it was a massive downgrade for the first movie. Because I had seen the first one so many times as a kid, and listening to the entire soundtrack on the drive to Disneyland Paris, I remember the songs more in the first Frozen than I do its sequel. Outside of Into the Unknown, everything musically just faded out of my brain pretty quickly. Overall, I don't necessarily think Frozen 2 is a bad movie. I just think it is a forgettable sequel in comparison to Frozen. It does have gorgeous looking visuals and good ideas sprinkled throughout, but a messy plot, uneven pacing, and forgettable characters are what prevent it from ranking any higher, or on the highs of my favourites from the revival era, making this my least favourite film to have released in the 2010s decade. You all know by now that the wartime package movies were going to be some of the hardest to rank compared to every other Disney movie. Instead of featuring one story, they are collections of shorts that are stitched together and put in theatres. And it's rare that this structure works for me. But this next one, despite being the shortest in the entire Disney canon, it does have the higher bar compared to the Three Caballeros, Make My Music, and Fun and Fancy Free, and that is Saludos Amigos. Saludos Amigos, to me, didn't even feel like a traditional movie. because it feels more like a documentary-style travelogue with some animated shorts thrown in there, with little story connecting everything. The second and third segments were standouts, but everything else just felt like filler. The animation was the strongest aspect of the film, with expressive character animations, particularly in Pedro the Plane, the llama in the Donald segment, and Goofy in his short. They did do a better job with the character animations than they did in other wartime anthology films that ranked below this one, but the live action footage was a mixed bag. But the transitions between the live action and the animation were done quite well, even better than the Three Caballeros. Even if the documentary stuff didn't work for me, and there isn't much I can talk about in terms of characters either. Saludos Amigos still didn't work for me, but it was easier to sit through than some other package films, but thankfully there are only 2 more to talk about from the wartime era. It's more enjoyable to sit through than the Three Caballeros, Make My Music, and Fun and Fancy Free, but after all, still falls into the wartime anthology curse.